Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the High Seas Treaty. Now, marking the culmination of over a decade of negotiations to protect the high seas that cover nearly two-thirds of the global ocean, UN member states last week agreed on a historic treaty for protecting marine life in international waters that lie outside the jurisdiction of any country. Now, the agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which will be formally adopted at a later date, will help achieve the global goal of protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030, which was agreed at the 2022 UN Biodiversity Conference. Even though the high seas comprise more than 60% of the world's oceans and nearly half the planet's surface, they have drawn far less attention than coastal waters and a few iconic species. Now, ocean ecosystems create half the oxygens humans breathe and limit global warming by absorbing much of the carbon dioxide emitted by us. Now, but they are threatened by climate change, pollution, and overfishing as well. The High Seas Treaty will oblige countries to conduct environmental impact assessment of proposed activities on high seas. The treaty also includes arrangements for sharing marine genetic resources such as biological material from plants and animals in the ocean. So today, we'll try and understand these and other aspects of this treaty. Why is it so significant and what does it bring to the table? And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Urmi Goswami, who's joining us here, senior journalist, keeps a close watch on all these developments. Welcome, Urmi, to our studios. We also have with us former ambassador Dr. Shilkant Sharma and Mr. R.R. Rashmi, distinguished fellow at TERI. It is also joining us. Welcome, both of you gentlemen, also to Sansad TV. Let me begin with you, Urmi, and let's first start by answering some obvious questions. What is the High Seas Treaty? I pointed out some aspects, but one, what is it? And two, why is it required?
So the High Seas Treaty, or the actual name for it is Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions. Look, it deals with biodiversity and life, and actually even the area which falls beyond the 370 kilometers or 200 nautical miles from a shoreline. So this is area which is belongs to no country. So it's literally the global common good. And because oceans are so important to the balance of the earth, because of absorbing carbon dioxide, as you mentioned, heat, and of course home to species, a large number of aquatic species, both flora, fauna, and are in these areas. Their protection is critical. Whether it's for the 30%, working towards the 30% by 2030 agreed to in Montreal, or just ensuring the balance in terms of climate change, ocean protection has become more critical. So this area, which belongs to nobody literally and belongs to all countries, actually had no rules. So this treaty, which looks at conservation of and preservation and protection of biodiversity in the high seas, is therefore critical for all the services it gives to human beings or to life on Earth. Let's put it this way.
Okay.
So that makes it critical. So you mentioned about and needing to do environmental impact assessment and sharing of the proceeds from marine genetic resources, which is access and benefit sharing. So basically, equitable sharing of these resources and the proceeds from it among countries. But it's also about management of these areas. So therefore, protected areas, marine protected areas where human activity will be limited. In terms of the environment impact assessment that you mentioned, it would be about seabed mining. You have to conduct. Right now, you can do it without, basically there are no rules and regulations. You at least now have a framework which recognizes there should be rules and regulations. So protecting actually the seas from our activities. And finally, also it's about building capacities. A large part of this world, the global south in many ways, doesn't have the capacity to deal with these issues. it's also about that. It's also about understanding better what the situation. So scientific sort of learning,
Okay.
building capacity, that's another focus area. And finally, why this becomes important is because we're also talking in terms of other agreements that we are currently either have agreed to in the past, like the climate treaties that are already functional, the biodiversity treaty you mentioned, but those to come, like the plastics treaty. So much of plastics get dumped into the ocean, right? They make their way to the ocean. It is, you need all these pieces to be in place so that actually we can move towards a planet or a functioning global community which maintains planetary boundaries. So that makes it important.
So basically, taking a holistic look at the challenges which face us in the short term and in the long run as well. And this is one particular area, high seas, where the focus was not so much on protecting these areas or their ecosystem as well, which will now become more part of the focus once this treaty is ratified, the draft is ready. Okay, let me bring in Mr. Rashmi here as well. Mr. Rashmi, two aspects. We've all been, hearing a lot about in the past 2 decades about climate laws, dealing with the threat of climate change and all that. But as Urmi was also pointing out, this high seas treaty, which we're talking about, takes into consideration the ocean laws as well, and perhaps look at both of them in a holistic manner rather than looking at both of them in different compartments. How effective do you think that has been, effectively taken care of in this treaty? That is, looking at both climate change laws or climate laws and ocean laws as well, not separately but together.
Thank you very much, first of all, having me on your show. The health of the oceans is very closely interlinked with what is happening to the climate. So while there is a law, international agreement on how to protect climate, there was so far no international agreement on how to protect the oceans. Several reports have been published. The IPCC came up with a very specific and very special report on oceans. They have published similar reports on the lands and other areas of the biosphere, the atmosphere. So just as climate system is important, it's equally important to look at the ocean systems. The oceans, the problem is that nobody is managing the oceans, at least the land and now the atmosphere, which is subject to an international law or an international agreement. Nobody is actually worried about or are actually doing something to protect the health of the oceans. We are only working in the areas, the territorial areas of the nations, the coastal areas, the 200 nautical miles, or the biodiversity located on the lands which are under the control or jurisdiction of a particular nation. These high seas have completely been left so nobody is actually looking at them. So it's very important that now there is an agreement on a global goal. How effective it will be, one doesn't know, but it is important to set the targets and the goals first. So there is a goal now, which and there is an aspiration. It could be an aspirational goal if we don't support it with means of implementation. So that's another riddle that we will have to solve. So while we agree on a target of 30 by 30, of protecting the 30% of the entire the oceans and bring the oceans under the protective system, just as we do it in the coastal areas and in the marine areas under the jurisdiction of the nations, we do it similarly for the oceans. And we take measures to prevent their further acidification and prevent their further loss of biodiversity and the wildlife and the marine species.
Okay.
Now, the problem is that there are splintered laws. There are laws, agreements for different sets of goals. For biodiversity, we have a global biodiversity framework, which was signed last year in Montreal. We have, for deep sea bed mining, we have another law. For access to and the benefits of the biodiversity, we have CBD. So we will have to work in tandem. These laws, international agreements have to be consistent with each other to be really effective.
Okay.
So while setting a target is very important, what I would like to stress is it's equally important to see how countries adhere to their commitments.
Okay.
And we have, I'm yet to see a framework of such commitments in case of the high oceans.
Okay.
We have a similar climate agreement where we have obligations are there, and the countries are expected to live by that. There is some kind of a transparency and reporting framework. I don't know whether we have agreed to something similar here.
Okay, we'll look at the implementation part as well, and that's a very important one. But let me first bring in, Mr. Shilkant Sharma here. And Mr. Sharma, let's look at another, story behind the story thing here as well, because this is one of those rare occasions when all UN member states have agreed on a draft of a treaty, and that too of a topic or an issue which is of utmost importance to the planet, to all the nations, to all citizens of the world. Now, this has been a long, drawn-out process, protected negotiations as well for more than a decade. What goes behind the scenes? That's going to be really interesting to note, because this is, and on issues like these, there is a sharp divide between, developed countries and developing countries, or the global south and global north.
Well, as you rightly mentioned, thank you, Vishal, for calling me. As you rightly mentioned, the UN system at least has got a boost in this treaty, because multilateral agreement has been signed after 30 hours of last minute draft negotiations for the draft, and the treaty text has been agreed. It is a big achievement in the sense that in these times where the differences and divergences are too many among the member states of the United Nations, and especially among the bigger countries. The fact that they have agreed for a treaty which is binding, it has binding implications. So it's a treaty which is not just for the sake of a treaty, but it has binding provisions. It's a very great achievement, and
Okay.
That's why the Secretary General has also come out and welcomed this. And then there is this institution also which has been visualized in this treaty. They talk about an international authority which will take stock of what is happening, because that is an important machinery which is required for these things. As Mr. Rashmi said, that they are actually otherwise a set of agreement, but there is no coordination, no cohesion among them. So how do they cohere? This is a very important aspect. Then there are these three very important dimensions. One is preventing pollution and environmental security. Second is equitable harnessing of the resources of the high seas. And third is the seabed, where there are very important minerals which are lying, which are critical for our future. Because when we talk about, say, green transition, when we talk about solar panels, we all require batteries, and magnesium, nickel, cobalt. They seem to be in abundant supply in these nodules which lie on the ocean bed. So ability of nations to prospect and make use of this and to exploit these resources is one factor, but equitable sharing and equitable exploitation is more important. At the moment, only US, France, Germany, Russia, China, and India to an extent have this ability to go there. But the large chunk of the developing South has no technological prowess at this moment. So this is an important area where also cooperation is necessary. So it is a kind of a framework of an international treaty under the UN auspices, where everyone is on board, and to get everyone on board, you have to really make it acceptable to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So this treaty has these aspects which are very important. Now, how do we go about it?
Okay.
This has to be ratified, signed and ratified. And once it comes, then the next process of implementation will start. So it is some distance away, but the very existence at least, puts some guardrails to this, merciless and rapacious exploitation of the oceans, which has been underway. For instance, fishing, there has to be some control, some regulation.
Indeed.
Now, There have been some conventions in the past, but this will also, add to them.
Okay.
And same way, protection of the biodiversity. There, the whatever is very very large number, 2.5 lakh of
Okay.
species,
Okay.
and they have to be protected.
Indeed.
And then
That's a very significant aspect, Ambassador Sharma. I'll come back to you, but the points which you have raised, and Mr. Rashmi was also talking about, Urmi, the key aspects of the treaty is to protect the marine ecosystem in these areas. That's one. Two, have an equitable share in whatever the marine ecosystem produces, and also most significantly, limit the effects of climate change or plastic pollution or other forms of pollution in these areas. Now the question is, and as Mr. Rashmi and Mr. Sharma was pointing out, it's a wonderful achievement. We have all UN member states have agreed on a particular draft, historic one as well. But how easy or difficult do you think implementing this will be? Because all countries have their own interests as well to take care of. And of course, then there is a larger interest we're talking about.
So, the first thing is that if you didn't have this agreement, there wouldn't be any rules that would follow from it, and therefore it would still be the Wild West out there in the high seas. So in that sense, it's important that you have this. Now, yes, implementation is important, compliance is important, but it's like having a traffic light, right? If you have a crossing without a traffic light, cars will go in every which direction. If you have a traffic light, the presumption is if it is a well-managed traffic light, everybody will adhere. If it's not a well-managed, we are hoping at least 50% will adhere. So that's the first step. So that's why this treaty is important. It's kind of having a traffic light, a more complex traffic light, but nonetheless. The second thing is that we need to realize that we are at that time in history or in the history of the earth where we are increasingly realizing that the ecological issues, whether it's climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, are impinging or are not separate from the other concerns that we have, whether it's economic, social, cultural, and they're all intertwined. And we are seeing more and more of this happen in every multilateral sort of agreement, in every multilateral organization. And I think the reason why this treaty at this point is interesting is not just because, as everybody says, it restores faith in multilateralism. We had a faith restored in multilateralism in Montreal just a few months ago. So yes, but it's also that you realize that more and more there are rules yes, there's an agreement to a rules-based world order, and now you have to look at compliance. How you look at compliance and how you ensure that all countries, including yourself, including your own country, is adhering to these norms is clearly a bit of you look out at the other, you look out at yourself kind of a thing, like we have had or we are hoping to have in the Paris Agreement, where each country is expected to do something. And I think ideally and finally we will be moving towards that, where every country has to balance the greater good. I mean, a lot of experts don't like this treaty, which is basically beyond biodiversity, beyond national jurisdictions treaty, being called the High Seas Treaty, because it kind of connotes that everybody, about how to make best use of the high seas in an ecologically sustainable manner. Rather they want, and this has also been reflected in the final draft, is how do you look at this area of a large portion of our oceans, which belong to no country per se, but which are a global good, a global common. How do you ensure that they serve a greater good?
Okay.
And I think that balance of your own interests and the global greater good can only be achieved if you have rules in place.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's literally going to be not just the Wild West, it's literally going to be the law of the jungle.
Okay.
The country that has more power, that has more economic heft, that has a bigger military or what have you, will be able to push, or has more power to get other countries to fall in line, will rule the roost.
Okay.
Now, it's not that it won't happen in this, but in having a treaty, there is at least one place where all countries are equal.
Okay, so the ball has been set rolling. At least now there are a set of norms which once ratified, everybody will have to adhere to. Mr. Rashmi, I'd like to bring you in here again. And let's talk about the global South. The countries which are part of the global South, the developing countries, the least developing countries as well. Those nations which are low on resources and also are at the risk of facing the worst effects of climate change in high seas as well. So how does it help them? Because this is a big question which has always been raised and being debated and discussed when we're talking about climate change issues and climate change laws as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is a perennial question which has come up again and again in the negotiations on environmental treaties, and more particularly in the case of climate. It's actually a sharing of global resources. Environment is also a resource. It's a global commons, but it's a resource nonetheless. And as in the case of climate, the debate has remained focused in the past on the sharing of the global atmospheric resources like carbon share. So similarly, in the case of high seas, this treaty, it's really a good achievement. But the proof of putting the line, eating, in the sense that the resources, as Mr. Sharma was mentioning, the resources have to be shared equitably by all the countries, and more particularly the countries in the global South who are vulnerable to environmental changes. Mm-hmm. So the question is actually, how do we ensure that the treaty is implemented in an equitable fashion? The protection of the oceans and the marine areas which are going to be declared as protected, and the areas which are going to be open to extraction of resources from the deep sea bed, or the other marine resources like fish and other biodiversity resources. How will they be shared? The access to those resources and the benefits from those resources will be shared equitably. Okay. This is something which we will need to very closely watch and remain closely engaged in implementation of this treaty.
Okay. Quick concluding one to you or me before we bring this to an end, because we're running short of time. Is the lowest hanging fruits, or rather the immediate focus areas when we're talking about moving ahead with this treaty. 30 by 30 is one goal which this treaty will help. But apart from that, what are we looking at in terms of what needs to be done practically on the ground in the implementation stages as well?
Well, one of the benefits, the quick benefits that we can get, or relatively quick benefits, is on plastic pollution. Again, because a lot of the plastic pollutants end up in the high seas. Shipping, we will see a lot of impact of this on shipping, because those negotiations are also underway. Pollution from ships and better usage of fuel. So we will see an impact in all those areas. At the end of the day, I mean, yes, we need better environmental impact assessments for all activities, whether on land or on sea, high sea, coastal areas. And yes, we need equity. But I think this is where I think India has a very big role to play. Not just because it's the G20 presidency this year, but also because of where it positions itself. It is that country which is both, at home in now the presidency of the G20, at home with the G7, but also knows what it is, what are the travails of being the least developed country or an island state. It's how you can come up with options,
solutions,
proactive solutions, options on addressing equity, instead of much more pragmatic and much more practical, so that we can move this conversation forward. I mean, one of the reasons why this treaty happened, as did the Montreal the agreement in Montreal, as did the loss and damage facility in Egypt. The reason it happened is because the global South came together and remained together, and that glue, because the global south is a huge thing. It's like
Indeed.
130 odd countries from China to, Burkina Faso. So you have to have that narrative that gets these diverse countries come together, work together. And I think India can play a big role in that. So that's on the other side, the diplomacy side of the
Diplomacy
conversation.
side of the aspect out there. Indeed, the greater global good which we were talking about, of course, taking care of the individual nation's interests also. Thank you so much, Urmi there, Mr. R. Rashmi, as well as Mr. Shilka Sharma for joining us and sharing your valuable inputs with us and our viewers. We're running short of time, but I'm sure, the debate on this topic will continue in the times to come as well, because this is an issue which is closely interrelated with our fight against climate change as well. And the amalgamation, or rather, holistic view of both climate laws and ocean laws is something which is being addressed as far as this treaty is concerned, taking care of various aspects of looking at ocean ecology, the ecosystem out there. How do we save it from the effects of climate change and also make use of the resources in an equitable manner for all the nations and all citizens of the world? We'll keep a close watch on the developments here and come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.